They say Pleasant Hill is gone, that it collapsed, that it faded into history like a failed experiment in faith. But they lied. Pleasant Hill didn't vanish. It evolved. Its blueprint, its methods of control, indoctrination, surveillance, and manipulation was too effective to bury. It was replicated, refined, and scaled. By whom? By the modern alliance between corporate empires and institutional religion. Yes, the merger. Let me explain. In 1835, just 1 year after the official records declared Pleasant Hill abandoned, a quiet land acquisition was filed in Ohio under a different name, the Harmony Cooperative. Its founders, two former guests of Pleasant Hill. One of them, Brother Nathan Richardson. The community renamed, relocated, and rebranded. Their techniques perfected. But more importantly, their model of power caught attention, not from religious seekers, but from industrialists. You see, the rise of mass manufacturing required more than machinery. It required obedient minds. Men who'd wake at 4:30, work without complaint, never question the clock, the quota, or the cruelty, just like Pleasant Hill. The first corporate schools in New York were modeled on Shaker education systems. The first employee dormitories in Pennsylvania used floor plans taken directly from Shaker schematics, and the first corporate loyalty oaths, carbon copies of Shaker pledges of spiritual obedience. Soon, pastors were brought in to bless productivity. Sermons preached submission as virtue. Render unto Caesar. God rewards the humble worker. Doubt is the devil's whisper. It wasn't about salvation, it was about scalability. Today, that alliance is everywhere. CEOs quoting scripture while laying off thousands. Mega churches preaching prosperity tied to product lines. Government contracts funneled through religious charities. Health mandates enforced by spiritued guilt. Tech companies using Shaker-style silence retreats for wellness compliance. They don't build communes anymore, they build brands, platforms, influence farms, but the doctrine is the same. Obey, conform, donate, return, repeat. And just like at Pleasant Hill, the illusion of choice is offered. You can be a Baptist or a Buddhist, a vegan or a carnivore, a capitalist or a minimalist, as long as you play within the grid, as long as you produce, consume, comply. But question the system itself. You'll feel it. The social freeze, the shadow bans, the polite exclusions, the quiet severance of ties. Because the modern cult has no walls, it doesn't need them. It's in your feed, in your paycheck, in your therapy, in your God. And if you don't see it yet, that's by design. Because the most powerful cult isn't the one you're afraid of, it's the one you think you've joined freely. They called it Pleasant Hill. But beneath the painted walls and orderly gardens was something colder than death. A machine disguised as a sanctuary. You see, Pleasant Hill wasn't just a religious commune, it was an experiment in perfect submission. The Shaker ideals, celibacy, communal living, renunciation of material goods, offered the perfect cover, the perfect mask. While the public saw spiritual purity, the Richardson family saw opportunity not to save souls, but to erase them. Imagine it, every hour of your life choreographed by people who smile at you during prayer while deciding privately whether your thoughts are pure enough to continue breathing tomorrow. It began slowly, with love bombing, a ritual welcome for new converts, warm meals, soft hymns, and gentle touches that masked the hook sinking into their minds. Converts handed over everything they owned. They gave away land, businesses, family heirlooms, and eventually, the very wiring of their beliefs. Each new member was assigned a spiritual caretaker. A Richardson, of course, not for guidance but for surveillance. You weren't allowed to question scripture without a Richardson nearby. You couldn't mourn your past without Martha Richardson whispering that grief was the devil's tool. Within weeks, your name was changed, your clothes stripped, your identity dissolved into the collective, and every thought you had, they heard it before you could say it out loud. And the cabins, those so-called retreat houses, they weren't for prayer, they were for breaking. Built far beyond the tree line, each one was soundproofed, window-shuttered, and sealed from the outside. Inside, one bed, one bucket, and a schedule of fasting and prayer so brutal that by day 3 the strongest minds cracked. They told you it was to cleanse your soul, but the real cleansing was of memory, rebellion, and resistance. Ask yourself this: what kind of leadership sees the expression of independent thought as an illness? You won't find Pleasant Hill in most American textbooks, because what happened there exposes a deeper truth, one that reaches far beyond Kentucky, a truth the powerful don't want you asking about. Who defines morality? Who polices your thoughts? And how much of what you call free will is merely permission granted by people like the Richardsons? Remember this: tyranny wrapped in scripture is the most dangerous kind, and Pleasant Hill was holy. Only on the surface. The deeper you dig into Pleasant Hill, the more the soil bleeds. We left off with the retreat cabins, those quiet torture chambers dressed as spiritual renewal, but there was something even more sinister happening beneath the surface. In 1813, a young woman named Sister Lydia Warren arrived from Cincinnati. She was 19, an orphan, gentle, devout, and eager to serve. The Richardsons welcomed her with open arms. Samuel himself called her a vessel for divine truth. Within months, she was gone. No explanation, no goodbye, just gone. Her bed stripped, her belongings reassigned, her name erased from the daily readings. When Sister Abigail, her closest friend, asked where Lydia had gone, she was sent on a spiritual fast to the retreat cabins for 12 days. She returned emaciated and silent. This became the pattern. One by one, members began disappearing, not in groups, always one at a time, and always preceded by some small act of defiance, asking about family, requesting outside letters, requesting medical help from town, and yet no local records show deaths. No burial sites have ever been confirmed, and no missing persons reports were ever filed by the community. Why? Because Brother Nathan Richardson, Samuel's youngest brother, had deep ties with the Mercer County Sheriff's Office. Every donation, every handmade piece of furniture gifted to public offices bought silence, influence, denial. The state archives list Pleasant Hill as a model Shaker commune up through 1834, but by then, over 100 names from the original community rolls had simply vanished, and it wasn't just physical disappearance. Their memories were erased from Pleasant Hill itself, journals removed, correspondence destroyed, oral stories restructured to cast each missing person as a fallen soul who had rejected God's truth and left voluntarily. It was rewriting history in real time. Imagine this power, not just to eliminate a human being, but to delete them from memory, to alter the very reality experienced by hundreds of people who had been conditioned not to question. The Richardsons didn't rule with whips, they ruled with truth distortion. And if you're still watching, I want you to write a phrase in the comments below, twice. The silence remembers everything. Write it once for the victims, and again for yourself, because you're not just watching a video, you're crossing a line into dangerous knowing. Let's talk about numbers, not the ones in the official archives. Those are lies, sanitized, edited, cleansed. I'm talking about the real numbers, the ones that were never meant to be counted. By 1830, Pleasant Hill's recorded population hovered just over 400, but internal inventory logs, discovered only in fragments, tucked behind floorboards in the western dormitories, tell a different story. These documents, smuggled out by an anonymous former member referred to only as Brother R, list meal allotments for 512 individuals, 512 mouths fed, 512 bodies housed, 512 lives controlled. But just 4 years later, by 1834, Pleasant Hill was abandoned. Overnight, no fire, no battle, No plague, just vanished. Buildings left intact, beds made, dishes cleaned, but no people, not a single trace of where those 512 souls had gone. And here's what should terrify you. The state of Kentucky declared the property uninhabited religious farmland. No investigation, no search. The land was marked for auction by spring. Why? Because the Richardson family line vanished with it. All public records of Samuel, Martha, Ezekiel, Rebecca, Caleb, and the others ceased in 1834. But we know this. A local merchant, Henry Leeds, reported selling 6 new horses and 2 carts to a well-dressed man with grey eyes and a northern accent on February the 16th, 1834, the exact week the community was deserted. Witnesses claimed to see wagon tracks leaving Pleasant Hill that same night, headed north toward Ohio. But no one followed. No one questioned. This was no accident. This was a strategic evacuation. You see, cracks were beginning to show. Outsiders were starting to whisper. In January, a traveling inspector from Ohio wrote in his personal log, "I am not permitted to speak freely, but the tension is so thick I fear the ground itself may split open. The people here do not blink unless given permiss. Ion." But the final blow? A young apprentice named Caleb Monroe, no relation to the Richardsons, was found unconscious in the stables with a hand-carved journal in his coat. In it were names, dates, disappearances, rituals, and a sentence that burned itself into the margins. God does not live here. Only those who use his name to disappear others. Monroe survived, barely. But when he tried to tell his story, he was institutionalized in Lexington for religious hysteria. He died 2 years later. Cause of death, listed as self-inflicted drowning, in a locked cell. This is what it costs to know the truth. Pleasant Hill wasn't just a religious community, it was a prototype. A test of how easily men can be reshaped, erased, and repurposed by those who understand control. Ask yourself this. What would it take to make 512 people disappear without a single scream reaching the outside world? The answer is terrifyingly simple. Total psychological architecture. Pleasant Hill didn't use chains. It didn't need to. The Richardsons had constructed something far more durable than prison bars. Belief systems, ritual, isolation, emotional dependency. You've heard of Stockholm Syndrome, yes? But what happened at Pleasant Hill goes even deeper. It was engineered spiritual entrapment. Let me show you how. Each member was stripped of their past life, name, clothes, memories, replaced with a new identity tailored by Sister Rebecca and Martha. This wasn't religious guidance. It was reprogramming. Members were assigned a confession partner, someone who they had to report every unclean thought to, daily. The twist? These partners were informants, feeding data to Caleb Richardson's inner circle. If someone dreamed of their former life, questioned why they hadn't heard from their family in years, mentioned a name not on the sanctified register, they were marked for recentering. Recentering began with sleep deprivation, then fasting, then what they called sacred reflection, a series of interrogations disguised as prayer sessions held in cold rooms under candlelight where you weren't allowed to speak for hours unless prompted. At the end, members often emerged changed, docile, emotionally blunted, obedient to the point of paralysis. Their eyes stopped moving with curiosity, they stopped asking names, they stopped remembering people who had disappeared. This is how 512 people could vanish and nobody screamed. Because nobody remembered what screaming was for. And if someone managed to resist, if they tried to leave, the forest around Pleasant Hill was booby-trapped. Yes, you heard that right. Hidden pitfalls, alarm lines strung between trees, even false trails that looped back into the compound. Several escapees were caught by Brother Caleb's night patrols. Their punishment, Silence, no trial, no counsel, just a closed-door meeting and a morning announcement. Sister Miriam has chosen to walk the spiritual path alone. Let us not speak of her again. The next day, her bed was empty. So I ask again, what would it take to erase 512 people? Not a massacre, not a miracle, just one family with a plan and enough time. And now that you've heard this, what do you believe about your own freedom? Because if it happened in Kentucky, it can happen anywhere. They called it divine alignment. But it wasn't divinity, it was domination, ritualized, rehearsed, and refined until the entire population of Pleasant Hill no longer knew where their obedience ended and their identity began. Every Thursday at dusk, the bell would toll, not from the chapel, but from the East Tower, the one no visitor was ever allowed to enter. That bell was different, hollow, measured, meant only for insiders. When it rang, every member was required to gather in the central hall, no exceptions. Children were woken from sleep, elders escorted from their beds, and when they arrived, they didn't speak. They stood in lines, silent, waiting. The hall was candlelit, not warmly, but in a way that made shadows stretch unnaturally across the floor. Samuel Richardson would stand at the pulpit, backlit like a prophet descending from scripture. But his words, they weren't prayer. They were recalibrations. He would list the names of members who had slipped from divine frequency, those who had failed to complete daily silence, those who asked questions, those who dreamed too vividly. One by one, these broken vessels were brought to the center, surrounded by singing, soft, rhythmic, strangely syncopated, and asked to confess their impurity, publicly. This wasn't repentance. It was ritualized humiliation. And while the community wept and prayed and begged God to restore their brother or sister's alignment, the Richardson family watched, studied, noting reactions, cataloging who cried too much or not enough. This was how they identified the next threats, the next candidates for isolation. Now pause with me, seriously, stop and think. What if every sermon you ever heard wasn't about faith, but was a blueprint to crush resistance? What if every amen was a test to see who truly submitted? Pleasant Hill didn't use violence first, no. Violence was the final tool reserved for those who survived all the others. They didn't just break bodies, they reprogrammed souls. And when that didn't work, they made you disappear. There is a reason Kentucky sealed the records. There is a reason the hall still stands, untouched, unclaimed. Because even now, when you walk its grounds, you can feel something watching. Not a ghost, something colder. A system that remembers how to wait. There's something you need to understand, something vital. Pleasant Hill wasn't just a closed community, it was a laboratory. And the Richardsons? They weren't clergy. They were engineers, psychological engineers, testing methods of manipulation, control, and identity erasure long before modern science had names for any of it. Each member was a subject, every prayer, a data point, every punishment a variable in a terrifying experiment on the elasticity of the human spirit. Want proof? Let's talk about Sister Eleanor Briggs. She was 32 when she arrived at Pleasant Hill, a midwife from Virginia with 3 surviving children, all handed over to the community at her request. She was seeking healing, peace, and faith. But Eleanor was different. She took notes, asked questions. She kept a diary sewn into the hem of her dress, and she began cataloging the disappearances. Her writing described the staged worship, the pressure sessions, and the invisible trials that occurred after nightfall. But what made her dangerous wasn't what she saw. It was what she resisted. Eleanor refused to confess thoughts she hadn't had, refused to participate in the ritual shaming of others, and worse, she began whispering her doubts to the children under her care. That's when she was summoned. Not to the retreat cabins, not to the hall, but to the root cellar. If you're from Kentucky, you know the old cellars dotting the bluegrass. Cold, damp, carved into hillsides. But Pleasant Hill's root cellar wasn't for vegetables. It was for resetting memory. Witnesses, what few remained, described strange chants echoing from beneath the western building. Smells like burnt honey and sulfur, and lights, soft, rhythmic pulses that glowed from the floorboards above. When Eleanor returned 3 days later, her diary was gone. Her posture, broken. Her voice, silent, not muted, silent, as if the part of her brain that understood language had been unplugged. She never spoke again. Her children were reassigned to new spiritual parents. Eleanor herself was reclassified as sacred mute. She tended the West Gardens until her death in 1833. Her grave, unmarked, her name missing from the memorial wall. But one of her sons, Micah Briggs, escaped years later, and before dying in the 1860s, he passed Eleanor's final words, etched into linen thread, hidden in her hem, to a local printer. It read, "They harvest not food, but memory. Do not let them seed you. Let that sink in." Because if what Eleanor wrote was true, Pleasant Hill was not just a cult, it was a blueprint for psychological farming, a place where belief was harvested, and doubt was the ultimate crime. By now you're beginning to see it, aren't you? Pleasant Hill was never about religion. It was about harvesting control, tilling the soul like soil, planting fear, reaping silence. And every structure, every schedule, every soft-spoken command was fertilizer. Now let me show you just how far the Richardsons were willing to go to protect their harvest. In the summer of 1824, a man named Dr. Ezra Halcombe visited Pleasant Hill. A state-licensed physician and lecturer, Halcombe was sent by the Kentucky Medical Registry to evaluate several religious communities for public health standards. But Halcombe was no fool. His letters to his sister, found decades later in a sealed attic in Frankfurt, reveal a man deeply disturbed by what he saw. The buildings were clean, the people thin but not starving. Yet Halcombe wrote, "There is a silence here that screams beneath the surface. The children do not make eye contact, the elders never blink, and the hymns, they sound like warnings." He stayed 3 nights, and on the 3rd, he broke protocol. He wandered. According to his final journal entry, he followed a child, barefoot, dressed in grey, who led him to the southern orchard, past the stone wall that marked the community's outer edge. There, Halcombe reported seeing something buried. Not just bodies, books, charred journals, scorched ledgers, shredded paper wrapped in oiled cloth, half buried under a circle of stones. He began to dig, taking several fragments for examination. He never made it home. On July 18, 1824, his horse arrived back in Lexington, alone, blood on the saddle, his case satchel missing, no body was found. Pleasant Hill's response? A single line printed in their annual ledger. Brother Halcombe has returned to the world. That's how they framed it. Disappearances weren't crimes, they were betrayals of faith. Those who vanished weren't victims, they were heretics, defectors, spiritually unclean. But you see the pattern now, don't you? Anyone who remembered too much, anyone who connected too many dots, anyone who stood at the edge of the illusion was erased. Not always physically, sometimes mentally, sometimes historically. Because the Richardsons understood what modern manipulators still use today, that the best way to kill truth is to redefine it. So ask yourself, who defines your truth, and how would you know? If it was never yours to begin with, how far can obedience be stretched before it snaps? Pleasant Hill found the answer, and it didn't snap. It bent. It molded. It absorbed resistance like a sponge soaks blood. But there was one member who didn't bend. His name was Brother Elias Boone, a Civil War veteran turned convert who arrived at Pleasant Hill in 1829 after losing his wife and child in a house fire. The perfect recruit, broken, guilt-ridden, eager for peace. Except Elias had seen real war. He'd seen men lie, bleed, and beg under the flag of righteousness. So he recognized the quiet violence in Pleasant Hill almost immediately. He didn't speak out, not at first. He watched. He listened. He waited. And then, in October of 1831, he began carving symbols. They were found on pews, beneath benches, even etched into the walls behind the grain cellar, arcane markings resembling old Masonic ciphers paired with Latin phrases like "Noli me tangere" and "Veritas occultatur." Translation: "Do not touch me." Truth is hidden. Each carving was carefully placed in areas only longtime members would notice. A silent signal, a breadcrumb trail, a dare. But someone noticed. Sister Patience Richardson, Martha's daughter and the family's record keeper, flagged the first etching as spiritually troubling. Within days, Elias was summoned before a closed council. No witnesses, no notes, but we know this. He didn't return to his quarters that night. The next morning, something unprecedented happened. The bell didn't ring. No morning prayer, no daily assignments. Instead, all 400+ members were called to the orchard. There, nailed to the ancient sycamore near the western path, hung Elias Boone's jacket, neatly folded, pierced through the chest with a wooden stake. Pinned beneath it, a single page torn from the Book of Psalms. "If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there." Samuel declared it a final offering from a soul torn between worlds. But the members knew. They never found Elias's body. They never mentioned his name again. But the carvings, they kept appearing, weeks, months. Even after Pleasant Hill was abandoned, farmers claimed to find new symbols etched into beams, fence posts, even beneath loose floorboards, decades later. So what does that tell us? That resistance doesn't die, not fully. It hides, it waits, and sometimes it speaks through symbols that whisper when no one else dares to. You're not just watching a story, you're reading the marks left behind by those who knew the truth and paid the price to pass it on. Let me take you deeper now into the part of Pleasant Hill that was never shown to visitors, not even to most members. They called it the Archive, but not because it stored history, it stored control. Hidden behind a false wall in the western dormitory, beneath a staircase that no longer exists, was a narrow corridor leading to what appeared to be a root cellar, but this room was colder than stone, unnaturally so, and inside were shelves, hundreds of them. Each shelf bore names, each name a box, each box a life. Diaries, letters, confessions, therapies, internal evaluations. And at the center, a table with shackles and a chair carved with verses. Not from the Bible, from doctrine the Richardsons wrote themselves. Verses that mimicked scripture in tone but bled coercion, things like, "A soul in doubt is a child unworthy of direction. To disobey is to be forgotten. Let silence be thy sacrament." That's not faith. That's programming. Here's where it gets darker. Every month, members who had shown restlessness were brought to the archive, not to be punished but to be recalibrated. This was done using a practice Sister Rebecca referred to in her coded journal as scripture reflection. The method, terrifyingly effective. The member was placed in the chair. A passage was chosen, usually one that mirrored their internal struggle. They were forced to repeat it for hours. If they resisted, they were not beaten. They were isolated in silence for days, then brought back. The cycle repeated, until the passage and their identity were inseparable. You see what this is, don't you? It's not healing. It's neuro-linguistic rewiring. By the time they were released, most had forgotten why they doubted. They only remembered the verse. A young woman named Sister Lydia underwent 8 sessions in the archive. Her last diary entry, smuggled out in a hollowed candle stick, read, "I can no longer remember my father's name, but I know the verse. Obedience is my garment, silence is my gift." Let that sink in. When someone forgets their name, but remembers the words forced into their mouth, that's not devotion, that's erasure. The archive was destroyed in 1834, not by fire, not by flood, by design. The Richardsons dismantled it brick by brick before vanishing. But some boxes survived. 3 to be exact. One was found in an attic in Cincinnati, one in a pastor's home in upstate New York, and one in a pawn shop in Indiana, labeled only, "Do not open, property of PH." Inside, a map, a list of names, and a phrase scribbled over and over, "Control is easier when they think they chose it." Tell me, how much of your life have you really chosen? Now we cross a line. Because what I'm about to reveal isn't just history, it echoes into now, into your life, your job, your church, your government. But it began here, in the forgotten fields of Kentucky. In the winter of 1832, a man named Reverend Josiah Merrow, a former Shaker leader turned whistleblower, tried to publish a small pamphlet in Cincinnati titled "The Hollow Light: Confessions from Pleasant Hill." Only 12 copies were ever printed. 11 were seized. The 12th, discovered in 1947, sealed behind plaster in the wall of a condemned farmhouse just miles from the original Pleasant Hill site. Its contents, chilling. Merrow described a secret ritual called the Great Sealing. It took place once a year, on the winter solstice, December 21st. Only full members of the Richardson bloodline were allowed to attend. No outsiders, no converts, not even the highest-ranking brothers or sisters. Here's what he claimed. At midnight, the family would gather in the root cellar with 13 lit candles, one for each founder. They would chant not in English, but in a guttural dialect unknown to any Shaker tradition. The walls would shake, not from sound, but from feeling. And always, always, someone would be missing the next day. A member. Gone. No burial, no announcement, just absence. And in their place, a new law, a new rule, a new restriction. Every great sealing wasn't just about sacrifice, it was about tightening control, giving up one body to reinforce obedience in 399 more. This is ancient, older than Christianity, older than any American sect. This is blood for order, a principle found in Babylon, in Rome, in the hidden chambers of every empire that ever pretended to be holy. What Josiah Merrow revealed wasn't a cult ritual, it was a psychological spell, a formula. Choose a symbol, make it sacred, sacrifice someone to it. Watch how the survivors obey. Pleasant Hill wasn't isolated, it was a testing ground, and the Richardson bloodline, they didn't vanish, they dispersed. One to Philadelphia, one to London, one to Washington, D.C., all with new names, new garments, but the same method. So here's what I ask you now. If one family could control 512 people with rituals, surveillance, and whispers of divine order, what could thousands do today? With phones, algorithms, language designed to bypass critical thought. Control didn't end at Pleasant Hill, it just evolved. And somewhere out there, the Great Sealing continues. There's a moment, quiet, sharp, when a man realizes he's not free. Not because of chains, not because of walls, but because his thoughts were given to him. Pleasant Hill manufactured that moment, intentionally. They called it the Revelation Chamber. It wasn't on any map, not mentioned in any records. But survivors, yes, there were a few, described it in tones reserved for hell itself. One such survivor was Isaac Morland, a boy of 12 when he arrived with his mother in 1830. He later escaped, 20 years later, under a new name, living quietly in Ohio until the day he died in 1891. His diary, discovered in a leather satchel decades after his death, describes the Revelation Chamber like this. A room so still, your breath sounds like thunder. A room with mirrors, not to see yourself, but to confront yourself. A voice speaks, but there's no mouth, and it tells you not who you are, but what you'll become. Let's stop pretending this was about religion. Let's call it what it really was: psychological weaponry. Inside that chamber, Isaac claimed, members were brought when all other tactics failed. When prayer, fasting, social pressure, scripture recitation, and spiritual isolation had failed to reshape the mind. This was the final crucible. The chamber used a combination of mirror placement, rhythmic sound, and flickering candlelight to induce disassociation. We now call it sensory manipulation. In the 1830s, it was simply God's last mercy. But it wasn't mercy. It was reprogramming through ego death. Isaac wrote that after 3 hours in the revelation chamber, he forgot his mother's name. By hour 5, he no longer recognized his own face in the mirror. And at the end, the voice returned. Calm, male. The world you knew was illusion. We will now build your truth. What happened after that session? Isaac never spoke for 12 years, not a word. But he followed. Every order, worked harder than anyone, never questioned again. Until one night, deep in winter, he saw another boy being led to that chamber, and something inside reignited. He fled, ran through the frozen cornfields barefoot, broken, bleeding, but free. And before he died, he wrote this: "They don't need to kill you to own you. They just have to make you forget that you ever existed outside their words." Think about that. Think about how many of your beliefs came from someone else's script. How many of your loyalties are borrowed. How many of your fears were installed. Pleasant Hill didn't disappear. It was archived into the global system. Its techniques refined, then digitized. Today, you don't need a revelation chamber. You just need a scroll feed, a sermon with ads, a mentor with motives. But ask yourself, who's building your truth? Because if you didn't write it, you're still in the chamber. Let me be clear now. This is where the descent becomes irreversible. If you keep listening past this point, something will change in you, and once you see what I'm about to show you, you can't unsee it. So if you're not ready to give up the lie, turn back now. Otherwise, let's keep going. After the final revelation chamber incident in 1833, Pleasant Hill began preparing for what the Richardsons called the withdrawal. But this wasn't a retreat. It was a transfer of power from physical territory to ideological territory. See, the Richardsons understood what so many cults failed to grasp. Land can be lost, but belief can spread like infection. So they created what they called the Legacy Network. This was a framework, not of people, but of concepts. They didn't just train leaders, they trained trainers. People who could implant systems of thought so subtle, so wrapped in virtue and morality, that the infected never even knew they were compromised. They disguised it as religious instruction, psychological counseling, even educational reform. It moved into churches, schools, philanthropic societies. Each group had different faces, different names, but at their core, they taught the same 7 phrases, always repeated, always embedded in harmless teachings. Doubt is the enemy of peace. Safety comes from structure. Obedience brings clarity. The individual must be purified through submission. Truth is not what is, but what must be believed. God speaks through order. Forget yourself to find yourself. Now here's the twist. These phrases didn't die in the 1800s. Versions of them appear, almost word for word, in certain modern motivational systems, mindset coaching, even corporate training manuals. That's not a coincidence. That's legacy transmission. You ever wonder why so many modern systems push sameness disguised as self-discovery? Why you're too old to find your purpose, but only within pre-approved templates? Why every elite institution, no matter its mission, seems to produce the same kind of obedient, compliant, socially polished individuals? Because the Richardson method works. They weren't just religious leaders, they were architects of influence. And when Pleasant Hill was dismantled in 1834, its final ledger entry was not a death toll. It was a single sentence. Let what we have built now pass unseen beneath the skin of the world. Pause. Read that again. Unseen, beneath the skin. That's not a burial, that's an injection. And now I need to ask something of you. Not for me, for you. If you've followed this far, it's time to choose. Comment these words below, twice, and only if you're ready. I see the unseen. I see the unseen. This isn't just a comment. It's a declaration that you're no longer just a spectator. You've crossed over, and the algorithm, both digital and spiritual, will now know where you stand. You've chosen to go further. Good. Because now we enter the part no textbooks cover, the aftermath, the real legacy of Pleasant Hill. When the community was officially declared disbanded in 1834, there were 407 documented members, but only 112 graves. No travel records, no transfer documents, no letters home, just a sudden collective disappearance. Local authorities chalked it up to mass relocation. Some claimed disease, others muttered fire, flood, famine, but there were no burn marks, no quarantine orders, and no bodies. Instead, there were rumors. For weeks after the closure, neighbors reported drifting smoke, sweet, chemical, unnatural. At night, strange chants echoed across the bluegrass hills. Livestock refused to go near the old meeting house. Children saw figures in white moving silently at dusk. One farmer claimed he found a woman's dress nailed to a tree, inside out, covered in scripture and stained red. But no investigation followed. Why? Because Pleasant Hill wasn't abandoned. It was sealed, like a tomb, like a crime scene that no one had the courage or permission to enter. And the Richardsons? Gone. Vanished like smoke into the folds of early American aristocracy. Samuel's trail ends in Boston under the name Elias Ware. Martha shows up in Paris, Kentucky, listed as Mesa Whitlow, founder of a spiritual school for gifted girls. Caleb appears as Inspector R in Cincinnati's Industrial Labor Board in 1836, each one resurfacing under a new mask. But here's what's worse. They didn't just vanish, they replicated. From 1835 to 1859, over a dozen intentional communities popped up across the eastern US, all claiming to be spontaneous spiritual collectives. But if you dig into their records, you'll find similar patterns. Closed membership, no outside correspondence. Therapeutic rituals resembling forced isolation, disappearances labeled as ascensions, and always with a founding family at the center. These weren't utopias, they were control laboratories, pilots. Pleasant Hill wasn't the beginning of something, it was version 1. And you need to ask yourself, what version are we living in now? Look around. Notice how every new structure, education, religion, tech, self-help, offers freedom through total identity surrender. The promise, we will fix you. The price, give us your mind. You think you're upgrading, but you're just moving into a better decorated chamber. It's not about belief anymore, it's about possession. Who owns your attention? Who scripts your self-concept? Who decides what's true for you? Because when you trace the legacy of Pleasant Hill through time, one truth becomes undeniable. We don't inherit truth. We inherit control disguised as truth. And unless you break that chain, You are not living. You are echoing. Now we enter the belly of the beast, because what comes next isn't just history. It's alive, pulsing beneath your society, your systems, your screens. Let me ask you a question. What if Pleasant Hill didn't die, but digitized? Think. Pleasant Hill's true genius wasn't isolation, it was integration. Control that didn't feel like control. A belief system that installed itself like code in minds, in routines, in identity. Now look around. What do you see? Apps that help you focus while harvesting your thoughts. Self-help movements, promising transformation through surrender. Online communities that reward sameness and punish doubt. Sound familiar? Just like Pleasant Hill, they offer simplicity, purpose, belonging. But the price? Critical thought, privacy, autonomy. Do you remember the 7 phrases the Richardson family implanted into their members? Let me show you their modern forms, the ones you scroll past every single day. Doubt is negativity. Structure equals success. Trust the process. Follow the system. Your truth is just resistance. There's freedom in discipline. Lose yourself to find your tribe. Same blueprint, new packaging, same outcome. Because once a belief system makes you doubt your own thoughts, makes you outsource your inner compass, you are no longer learning, you are being formatted. And here's where it gets cold. Pleasant Hill needed surveillance towers. You carry yours willingly. You call it a phone. They needed elders watching conversations. You post them voluntarily. You call it engagement. They built the revelation chamber. You scroll through it, call it motivation. But it's the same machine. And the architects, they wear suits now. They speak at conferences. They don't chant. They publish. They don't isolate you in cabins. They isolate you in identities. Algorithms that track your shame. Targeted content that breaks you down and rebuilds you in their image. Not to sell, to shape. We once feared brainwashing, now we subscribe to it. And here's the part they don't want you to know. The Richardson method, the real method, wasn't about compliance. It was about obedient creativity. Building men who thought they were choosing while echoing the will of someone else. That's what most people call success today. Don't believe me? Check your feed, check your thoughts, see how many of them are borrowed. So I'll ask you again, are you building yourself or are you being built? Because the system didn't vanish. It scaled, it optimized, and it's smiling through your notifications. You're still here. That means you felt it. The flicker. The moment when the truth starts to peel back the skin of everything you thought was real. Now we need to talk about what happens when a system starts to lose control. When cracks appear in the facade. When someone sees too much. At Pleasant Hill, that moment came in 1834. A young convert named Naomi Hale, just 19 years old, began writing coded messages into the seams of the quilts she was assigned to make. Messages like, "He watches through the mirror. I dreamed of my old name. They eat memory with honeyed bread. Please read this and leave." Naomi was part of the embroidery division under Sister Rebecca Richardson. Her job was to stitch scripture verses into linens for visiting clergy. But Naomi, born in Boston to a family of intellectuals, knew how to hide language in pattern. She embedded dissent into geometry. She bent thread into testimony. One quilt, recovered decades later, contained over 400 coded phrases, discovered only when a restoration expert noticed irregularities in the stitching frequency. They used reverse steganography to reveal full sentences. One line read, "The fire comes when obedience fails." Another, "I buried proof beneath the weeping elm." The last one, "They won't kill me. They'll make me a hymn." Naomi vanished 1 week after delivering that quilt to brother Ezekiel. No funeral, no record. But 3 weeks later, Pleasant Hill introduced a new song during worship. Naomi's Peace, a hymn of submission. They turned her defiance into doctrine, her disappearance into devotion, her voice into a trap. This is how systems survive exposure. They absorb the rebel, they digest dissent, they turn whistleblowers into warnings. You've seen this in your world. A radical voice goes viral, then suddenly it's rebranded. Their message diluted, commodified, turned into merry shandais, inspiration porn, or corporate diversity slides. It's not just censorship, it's conversion. Because the final weapon of control isn't silence, it's celebration. You think you're honoring a martyr, but you're dancing to the song they were buried in. So here's what you must understand now. The most dangerous truths are never deleted. They're remixed, repackaged as safe, sold back to you as wisdom, until they lose their teeth, their fire, their ability to wake you up. Naomi tried to warn them. She tried to warn you, and somewhere beneath that weeping elm, her truth is still buried. The question is, will you dig it up, or will you let the hymn play on while the system dances? They always tell you the law exists to protect you, but history, true history, tells a different story. The law does not protect the people. The law protects the system. Let's go back. After Pleasant Hill was dismantled, Kentucky state records showed a strange spike in benevolent welfare ordinances. On the surface, they were simple rules for how to manage at-risk citizens. Standards for spiritual health, regulations on emotional instability, and non-compliance within religious communes. But if you read closely, a pattern emerges. One such document, Mercer County Provision 14B, included a clause stating, any individual demonstrating persistent nonconformity within a recognized spiritual structure may be subjected to involuntary solitude for purposes of purification and guidance. Sound familiar? That wasn't legislation. It was Richardson Protocol. Retreat cabins now written into civic law. Between 1835 and 1845, at least 9 other counties across 3 states passed similar language. No debate, no opposition, just quiet approvals in dusty rooms by tired men holding pens dipped in influence. How? Because the Richardson family didn't need to win elections, they just needed access. A dinner with the sheriff, a donation to a judge's campaign, a whisper in a reverend's ear. Control the church, control the court, control the town, and then rewrite reality. By 1842, non-conforming religious behavior was cited in over 300 detentions in the tri-state area. No charges, no trials, just protective holding. One documented case involved a 27-year-old woman, Sarah Levington, who attempted to leave her commune after discovering what she called spiritual discrepancies. She was arrested in Harrodsburg and held in solitary confinement for 49 days. The official record states, spoke repeatedly of phantom voices and perceived control systems, recommended extended spiritual realignment. Translation, she saw the truth, and the system made sure no one ever heard her again. When her family tried to intervene, they were told she had voluntarily entered a cloistered program for soul repair. She was never seen again. Let that sink in. The law didn't break the cult rewrote the law, and every man who signed those provisions thought he was doing God's work. You think this stopped in the 1800s? You think it died with them? Then explain why, right now, in modern countries, you can be detained without charge for mental health assessment, simply for refusing to comply with state-approved behavior. Explain why dissent is called extremism, why privacy is suspicious, why isolation is framed as healing, why truth-seeking is labeled dangerous. Because the Richardson legacy was never about religion. It was about control systems disguised as compassion, compliance written in legalese, obedience enforced by policy, And once it's in the law, you don't need chains. You only need paperwork. Let me say it clearly, if the law ever tells you what to think, it's no longer law, it's doctrine. And you, my friend, are living in a pleasant hill of your own. They always told you universities were sanctuaries of thought, free places, open minds, temples of curiosity where ideas could breathe. But what if I told you the Pleasant Hill system didn't just infect religion or law? It put on glasses, wore a tweed jacket, and walked straight into the American university system and rewrote your future. Let's rewind. 50. Lexington, Kentucky. A newly chartered institution appears, the Southern Seminary of Behavioral Perfection, privately funded, publicly modest, but behind the curtain, its board included 3 figures with ties to the Richardson diaspora, including one, Dr. E.W. Langston, believed to be Ezekiel Richardson himself, under a false name. Their focus, a brand new field, cognitive regulation through devotional frameworks. Sound clinical, sound smart. But its core curriculum was built on spiritual obedience, isolation theory, and psychometric reinforcement. Translated, how to train minds to submit voluntarily. This seminary produced the first wave of what they called social discipline engineers. Most graduates didn't become preachers, they became curriculum developers, textbook editors, and education policy advisors, and they spread quietly, like spores. By 1890, elements of Richardson indoctrination appeared in early public education texts, such as moral clarity requires orderly instruction. Disruptive curiosity is a sign of spiritual fracture. Children should strive to please the greater vision. Sound harmless, right? Until you realize these were seed phrases, designed to reward conformity and suppress independent thought. Now ask yourself, why does the modern school system prioritize obedience over insight? Why are children taught what to think long before they learn how to think? Why does testing focus on recall, not reflection? Why do you raise your hand to speak, sit in rows, wait for bell? It's because you were not educated, you were formatted. And here's the darkest part. In 1903, a coalition of Richardson-influenced educators published a paper under the name The Human Harmonization Initiative. It included a chilling line. The key to a docile generation is training minds to fear their own questions. Let me say that again. To fear their own questions. Not authority, not punishment, but themselves. Once that's accomplished, you don't need to control them anymore. They'll police their own minds. Sound familiar? In 2025, most men don't need surveillance. They carry it within. They censor their doubts. They feel guilt for thinking differently, and they call it growth. No chains, no cult robes, just lesson plans. Credentialed obedience. The system that began in a Shaker commune didn't die. It got accredited, and now it hands out diplomas instead of robes. But the doctrine is the same. Conformity equals virtue. Questioning equals sin. You were told education would set you free. But Pleasant Hill taught a different lesson. The best prison is the one you decorate yourself. You think the cult ended with robes and hymns? No, it just put on a suit. You see it now, don't you? The pattern that started in a Kentucky commune slithered into religion, law, education, and finally the last temple of control, the corporate world. Because once you master belief and you master obedience, what comes next is the soul of the modern man. Labor. Let's strip away the branding, the free coffee, the ping-pong tables, the "we're all family here" energy. What you really have is Pleasant Hill reborn. A place where you're assigned a number, you're told when to eat, when to speak, when to rest. Your performance is tracked, your thoughts must align with the mission. Sound like a job, or does it sound like a commune in 1834? Let's talk about the Richardsonian labor model, because yes, it exists. Documents recovered in 1979 from a defunct Kentucky law office included a ledger labeled ER Operations Framework. Ezekiel Richardson again, his fingerprints never left. Inside was a system of labor optimization techniques based on behavioral compliance curves. Maximize output through emotional guilt cycles. Reward loyalty with micro-privileges, not autonomy. Rotate duties frequently to prevent mastery and questioning. Install language of devotion. Calling, mission, family. Use burnout as a test of obedience, not a failure of leadership. If you think this stayed buried, you haven't been to a company retreat lately. They call it culture. But it's code, rituals, slogans, corporate creeds. You're not just working, you're belonging, but only if you play the game. Only if you adopt the right posture, the right values, the right face. You're told to bring your whole self to work, but only if your self matches the system's software. Try showing your real thoughts in a team meeting. Try expressing radical honesty in your performance rev. i.e., try walking away from your phone for more than 24 hours without consequence. You'll find out quickly, you are not free, you are leased. And the scariest part? The Richardson method anticipated resistance. It knew that some men would wake up. So they built a pressure valve. They called it leadership tracks. Modern corporations call it promotion. A system that tells the most questioning, most restless minds, you're not being controlled, you're rising. So you chase the title, the corner office, the glass trophy. But by the time you get it, you're the one now enforcing the culture. You've become the new Samuel Richardson in a Patagonia vest. The robe has changed. The hymns sound like mission statements. But the game is the same. They don't want your labor. They want your loyalty. They want your identity. Just like Pleasant Hill, where devotion masked domination, where praise concealed possession. So ask yourself, when you wake up in the morning, are you living a purpose or fulfilling someone else's plan? Because the cult isn't gone. It just has a stock ticker now, and every time you clock in, you tithe. You followed the trail this far, through religion, law, education, and labor. Now it's time to stare into the screen. Because what was once Pleasant Hill's doctrine is now your digital life. Let me say it clearly. The Richardson family didn't die out. They evolved. They became code. They became design. They became the algorithm you think is helping you, but is shaping you. Let's return to Pleasant Hill one final time. In 1832, Sister Patience, yes, the forgery expert, developed a prototype for what she called the mirror path. It was a ledger system that cross-referenced each member's spiritual progress, private doubts, and public obedience. Each soul was assigned a reflection score, a number, a rank, a measure of purity. Low scorers were quietly retreated. High scorers received more privileges, praise, and visibility. Sound familiar? You're living it right now. They call it engagement, follower count, reputation score, content visibility. You're being mirrored every second, measured, ranked, scored. And just like Pleasant Hill, you get rewarded for obedience to the system's design. Keep scrolling. Stay positive. Never ask the real questions. And whatever you do, don't stop posting, because silence is suspicion, and doubt is a shadow ban. Let's dig deeper. Have you ever felt like your phone knows you too well? That moment you think of something and there it is, offered to you like a gift? That's not magic. That's the digital brother Caleb, watching, listening, tracking patterns, assigning meaning. And remember Sister Rebecca? The one who could break a person and rebuild them in 6 months? Her methods are now used in user experience design. Not by accident, by blueprint, emotional manipulation at scale, micro-validation loops, digital dependency by design. Pleasant Hill didn't vanish. It became your interface. Your lock screen is your chapel. Your feed is your gospel. Your behavior is being shaped by unseen hands you've mistaken for choice. They taught you to see the algorithm as a neutral tool, but it's not. It's a ritual system. Each like, each swipe, each comment, a prayer to a god you didn't know you were serving. And here's the cold truth. You trained it, and now it trains you. So when you look at your reflection in the black glass of your phone, ask yourself, who is looking back? Who have I become? Who is choosing what I think? What part of me is still mine? Because this screen you're holding, it's the modern altar of the same system that built Pleasant Hill, and every time you scroll without awareness, you bow. They want you to believe branding is harmless, a name, a logo, a slogan. But what if I told you that modern branding is built on ritual magic? What if every product you touch, every logo you trust, every jingle you hum is a spell? Let's go back again. In 1829, just 5 years before the collapse of Pleasant Hill, Sister Martha Richardson introduced a community-wide initiative called Divine Marks. Every family in the commune was assigned a unique symbol, a triangle inside a circle, a broken tree, a spiral within a hand. Each symbol was embroidered on clothing, tools, furniture, even tattooed on some of the more devout members. Martha called them marks of obedience, but their true function was deeper: identification, integration, indoctrination. A mark wasn't just decoration, it was a sigil designed to program recognition into the subconscious. After a few weeks, people responded emotionally to their own symbol: pride, security, loyalty. And when those symbols were removed, anxiety, disorientation, loss of identity. Sound extreme? You felt it the last time your favorite app icon changed, that jarring discomfort, that sense of something being wrong. That's programming. The Richardsons had discovered what corporations use today: symbolic anchoring. Fast forward. Now walk through a mall, look at your phone screen, open your fridge. Do you see golden arches, a half-eaten fruit, a check mark, a red play button? You're not seeing logos, you're seeing seals of initiation. Each one taps into neural pathways built on repetition, ritual, and trust. You've bowed to them 1,000 times without realizing, opened the app, sipped the bottle, worn the brand, defended it online like a belief system, because that's what it is. Brand loyalty isn't preference, it's faith. And here's the kicker. The early advertising pioneers, Edward Bernays, Claude Hopkins, and Rossa Reeves, were all documented as studying religious symbology. They knew what the Richardsons knew, that a symbol, repeated often enough, rewires identity. So when you wear a logo across your chest, post a branded quote on your story, or say, "I could never live without insert product," you're not expressing personality. You're reciting liturgy. You're wearing your cult colors. Think that's dramatic? Try this. Strip every brand from your life for 7 days. No logos, no slogans, no corporate rituals. See what's left of your identity, because this isn't just about consumption, it's about control. You are what you repeatedly worship. And in the modern world, worship looks like brand loyalty. Pleasant Hill didn't vanish. It got a design team, a marketing budget, and it learned to speak your language. One mark at a time, one product at a time, one identity at a time. And now, the question isn't, do you belong to a cult? The real question is, which one? They tell you to unlock your potential, to level up, to become your highest self. But what if I told you that the self-help movement, your podcasts, masterminds, and millionaire coaches, was seeded with the exact same structure Pleasant Hill used to enslave 400 souls in the name of transformation? Let's pull the curtain back. The year was 1833. The Richardson family faced growing unrest. Whispers, doubts, fractures in their control system. So Sister Rebecca, master of identity reconstruction, introduced something new: the path of purification. It was branded as a spiritual enhancement program, a 7-day experience, exclusive, elite, by invitation only. The structure: Day 1, destroy your old self. Day 2, silence your doubts. Day 3, confess your weaknesses. Day 4, embrace new truths. Day 5, obey the higher calling. Day 6, rebuild your role. Day 7, commit or be cast out. They called it enlightenment, but it was indoctrination. Sound familiar? Now scroll through Instagram, you'll see its descendants. Coaches, gurus, influencers, selling inner alchemy and mindset mastery. They wear hoodies instead of robes, but the doctrine is the same. Break yourself down so we can tell you who to become. And just like the Richardsons, these modern spiritual entrepreneurs use the same tools. Love bombing. You're special for being here. Isolation. Not everyone will understand your journey. Language hijacking. Fear is growth, doubt is resistance, suffering is proof you're evolving. False choice. You're either committed or you're stuck. You pay for access. You chant the affirmations. You journal their words. You wear their phrases like armor. No excuses. Obsessed is a gift. Kill your comfort zone. But you're not transforming. You're being reformatted. Pleasant Hill didn't disappear. It became a retreat in Bali. A Zoom call at 5 a.m. A $997 core. See, that promises to save you from yourself. And here's the final twist. Most of these coaches, they're not evil. Many were programmed themselves. The Richardsons built something so potent, so viral, that it embedded itself in every path to greatness. The cult became self-replicating, and every time you hear, trust the process, surrender to the work. Don't ask why, just go all in. You're hearing echoes of Rebecca Richardson's voice, centuries later. She doesn't need to sit in your room, she's in your playlists, your daily planner, your mirror. And now, brother, you need to choose. Do you want to awaken? Or will you continue to climb the mountain they built for you, only to find their throne waiting at the top? Because here's the final truth of Section 22. Any system that demands your obedience to free you was never freedom to begin with. In Pleasant Hill, no secret stayed buried. You were watched, measured, interpreted, but you already knew that. What you didn't know is that the surveillance never stopped. It just went wireless. Let's rewind. Brother Caleb Richardson, the enforcer, the listener, the silent shadow, built a primitive network of informants. He trained them to log everything: who spoke to whom, who hesitated in prayer, who avoided eye contact during sermons. And every night, those logs were reviewed, analyzed, filed in ledgers labeled faith drift, disruption probability, conversion integrity. Sound familiar? You call it metadata. They called it soul tracking. Fast forward 2 centuries. Now the Richardson system wears a smile and asks, allow app to access your microphone. Would you like a more personalized experience? This app requires location permissions to continue. You tap allow. You always do. Because unlike Pleasant Hill, you volunteered. But here's the revelation. Brother Caleb's strategy wasn't just about control. It was about predictive loyalty modeling. He wanted to know not just who you were, but who you were becoming. Before you even knew, that model has evolved. Now it lives inside the apps you scroll, the ads you swipe, the suggestions you think are random. They know when you're tired, when you're vulnerable, when you're most likely to say yes. Just like the Richardsons, Big Tech isn't content with your actions. They want your internal weather report, your hopes, your fears, your next move. They don't need confession booths. They've got data lakes. Every click is a candle on the altar. Every search is a silent prayer. And like Pleasant Hill, they reward obedience. You show loyalty to the algorithm, you get reach, you get dopamine, you get attention, but question the system, speak the forbidden, ask why things are the way they are. Shah, Dow banned, suppressed, erased. Just like Brother Thomas Whitman. Remember him? The man who dared ask why 400 members weren't accounted for. He was logged, handled, deleted from history. Now it's you. Asking why your post didn't show up, why you suddenly see fewer likes, why your opinions feel like they're sinking into a silent void. That's not a glitch. That's design. Because the modern system didn't abandon the cult's surveillance model. It perfected it. And here's the chilling truth. You're the informant now, every time you tag a location. Like a post, react to a video, tell the AI how it's doing. You're feeding the machine your own profile of vulnerability. You're building the trap from the inside. So ask yourself, if the device knows your every thought, if the system adapts faster than your skepticism, if the algorithm knows you better than your mother, are you free, or just a well-lit subject in the cult's newest chapel? The Richardson method has no more walls, because now you carry it in your pocket. They told you therapy would heal you, that medication would balance you, that mental health was the modern path to freedom. But what if the system offering you peace was the same system that broke you in the first place? You need to understand this. In the final year before Pleasant Hill collapsed, the Richardson family faced a crisis. Dozens of members were breaking down, emotionally, psychologically, not from sin, not from trauma, but from a systematic collapse of self. They were no longer who they were. They weren't allowed to be who they might become. So they fractured. Sister Martha called it divine imbalance. Her solution, medicinal compliance. The kitchens, once places of nourishment, became apothecaries. Herbal concoctions laced with poppy extract, foxglove tincture, belladonna microdoses. One draft for unproductive thoughts, another for spiritual anxiety, a third, stronger, for those contemplating escape. Each dose was justified as care, but it was sedation. You think this is history? Now look around you. How many men in your circle are on SSRIs, ADHD meds, mood stabilizers? How many diagnoses have exploded in the last decade? Why is the solution always a pill, never the dismantling of the system that made you sick? Let me speak clearly. The cult didn't vanish. It got licensed. It got certified. It opened clinics. It started using words like wellness, resilience, and support. But the goal is still the same: compliance, numbness, disconnection from true inner rebellion. You're anxious not because you're broken, but because your instincts are trying to warn you. You're depressed not because of a random imbalance, but because your soul knows this world is upside down. But instead of honoring that call to revolt, they hand you prescriptions. They reframe your discomfort as a pathology. They turn your holy discontent into a disorder, just like Pleasant Hill, where questioning was seen as sickness, and rebellion, that was labeled demonic possession, or today, oppositional defiant disorder. And here's the twist. The Richardson archives show that the most compliant members were the most medicated. The most at peace were the most chemically subdued. The ones they said were healed were simply silent. Ask yourself, who benefits when you stop feeling? Who profits when you stop fighting? Who gains when you accept your pain as your fault? Because your pain might just be the last honest thing you have. And if you numb it long enough, you won't become free. You'll become functional, like a cog. Like a cult member who sings during the sermons, but never dares to speak their own song. This isn't anti-therapy. This isn't anti-medicine. This is a warning. If the healer works for the machine, you're not being healed. You're being prepared to obey, to conform, to forget the part of you that still burns. You were taught to believe school was a path to freedom, a way out, a ladder to rise. But what if I told you, school was never meant to liberate you? It was designed to domesticate you? Welcome to the classroom of obedience. Let's go back to Pleasant Hill, 1830. As children began to outnumber converts, the Richardson family established what they called the House of Instruction. It wasn't a school. It was a template. Each child from the age of 4 was assigned a schedule. Wake at 4:30. Recite truth verses. Perform labor before morning lessons. Attend scripture memorization and obedience drills. Maintain silence between meals. Submit journals of self-reflection for review. The goal, not knowledge, not wisdom, not curiosity. The goal was internal compliance. A child that questioned was disciplined. A child that obeyed was praised. A child that surpassed others. Isolated and reshaped until their brilliance served the system, not the soul. Now look around. The school bell, the rows of desks, the memorization, the standardized testing, the shame of failure, the reward of obedience. You weren't educated, you were formatted. The modern classroom is not evolution, it is replication. Just as the Richardsons needed citizens of Pleasant Hill to submit to hierarchy, so too do modern institutions require citizens who obey rules, follow schedules, accept evaluation from above, and never question the frame itself. And remember this, in Pleasant Hill, the children who excelled at questioning weren't promoted. They were pulled aside, mentored privately, neutralized early. In today's system, they call those kids disruptive, unfocused, emotionally volatile, too intense. So they medicate them, label them, silence their spark, because it burns outside the curriculum. You're told the purpose of school is opportunity, but the truth, it's social conditioning in slow motion. You're graded not on your potential, but on your predictability, your ability to submit, to delay instinct, to prioritize approval. The real curriculum: wait your turn, speak when spoken to, don't think too fast, don't feel too deep, and whatever you do, don't wake up too soon. Why? Because if too many of us questioned the framework, the entire machine would crack. Pleasant Hill's House of Instruction didn't disappear. It got funding, it got federal standards, it started calling itself public school, and now your children are passed through the same structure, told to chase dreams through pathways paved by people who profit when they don't think for themselves. So when you ask why you feel like something's missing, why you work so hard and still feel unfree, maybe it's because your awakening was interrupted long before you ever had the words to name it. They say it's just entertainment. Just a song, just a movie, just a show. But what if every melody, every frame, every word was designed not to entertain you, but to entrain you? Let's go back to Pleasant Hill one final time. By 1832, the Richardson family noticed something troubling. Even with isolation, surveillance, and sedation, some members still resisted. So sister patients, yes, the same patients who forged documents and crafted illusions, proposed a solution. Give them stories, give them dreams, give them symbols they can't escape. And so began the night performances, spiritual dramas staged every Sunday night. They used costumes, candlelight, rhythmic chants. They told cautionary tales of those who questioned the elders and vanished. They dramatized loyalty, sacrifice, obedience. They made the deviant the villain, the compliant the hero. Sound familiar? Now turn on your screen. Hollywood.Netflix, Spotify, TikTok. You think it's accidental? Every frame, every sound, every lyric engineered with military-grade behavioral psychology behind it. Why do most hero stories start with trauma? Why are you addicted to redemption arcs that require submission to systems? Why does every dystopia end in acquiescence disguised as peace? Because entertainment isn't just consumption, It's calibration. Your brain doesn't know the difference between fiction and memory. When you see it, feel it, cry with it, you're training your nervous system what to expect from the world. Pleasant Hill's Sunday night stories were small scale. Today's cult uses billion-dollar studios. They don't need to isolate you in the woods, they just hand you a screen. Ask yourself, why do the rebels in movies always end up alone, dead or defeated? Why do love stories always involve compromise, dependency or trauma bonding? Why is masculinity either violent or pathetic? Why do modern villains often sound like ancient truth-tellers? Because the modern cult doesn't burn books, it writes the scripts. It floods you with images that shape your reality. That you're not enough without their product, that freedom looks like fame, that safety lies in sameness. You think you're choosing content? No, the algorithm is choosing you. It studies what makes you pause, what triggers a reaction, what you'll tolerate tomorrow that you resisted today. This is not entertainment, this is emotional engineering. And just like the Richardson family's performances, it always ends with the same unspoken command. Return to the fold. Doubt is dangerous. Be who we need you to be. And here's the hardest truth of Section 26. Your mind is not your own until you reclaim the stories inside it. Because until you do, you're just an actor in their script, a character in a play you didn't audition for, reading lines you never chose. You think you're awake because you're angry, because you post, because you protest, because you fight the system. But what if I told you your rebellion was scripted too? This is the final perfected mechanism of control: false rebellion, manufactured dissent, engineered outrage. Let me show you how it began. In Pleasant Hill's final year, 1834, whispers of escape began to spread. Too many members had vanished. Too many prayers had gone unanswered. Faith was cracking. So what did the Richardson family do? They created an enemy within. They discovered a secret heretical faction, a splinter group accused of sabotaging worship, stealing resources, and undermining the sanctity of the community. In truth, this faction never existed, but it served a powerful purpose. It gave the people someone else to blame. Now members could direct their suspicion, their rage, not at the leadership, but at the manufactured dissidents. The cult had created the perfect trap. They controlled both the shepherds and the wolves. Now fast forward to today. Look around. How many influencers, commentators, resistance movements do you see that sell truth for profit? How many anti-establishment voices seem to rise too quickly, say just enough to feel edgy, but never so much that they threaten the true foundations? Controlled opposition isn't just a theory, it's an essential tactic. The system knows you're waking up, it knows you're angry, so it gives you targets. This party, that figurehead, this movement, that identity. It lets you scream, as long as you scream in the direction it designed. You think you're revolting, but you're reinforcing. You're feeding the algorithm. You're confirming your psychological profile. You're predictable. And once you're predictable, you're no longer dangerous. You're manageable. The Richardson family understood this perfectly. After planting their fake dissenters, they allowed members to cleanse the community, to expose, shame, isolate the so-called rebels. It gave them a false sense of control, a ritual of rebellion that led only deeper into the cult's hands. Today, you're offered the same thing. Digital pitchforks, comment wars, activism with hashtags, protests sanctioned by the very forces you're protesting. Ask yourself, why does your rebellion come with a merch store? Why are you encouraged to speak truth but punished when you act on it? Why is the loudest outrage always allowed to trend? And why, despite all this noise, has nothing fundamental changed? Because the system built you a stage, let you rage, then handed you applause so you'd never leave the theater. But rebellion, real rebellion, doesn't look like retweets. It doesn't go viral. It's quiet. It's lonely. It's terrifying. Because real rebellion starts when you ask, what if everything I fight was designed for me to fight? And then you go silent, and you step off the script, and that's when they really notice you. That's when you become a threat. Not because you're loud, but because you're free. You were born with a yearning, a thirst for meaning, a hunger for the eternal. They called it faith. But what if I told you your deepest longing, your sacred fire, has been weaponized against you? You see, at Pleasant Hill, when the surveillance failed, when the labor camps failed, when the medicine and fear and ritual drama failed, they turned to their final control mechanism, salvation. The Richardsons unveiled a new doctrine, the path of returning. It was beautiful, comforting, and deadly. They told you this: no matter how far you stray, no matter how dark your thoughts, you can always come back, if you submit completely. But here's the hidden poison. This wasn't mercy. This was erasure disguised as grace. The path of returning required total confession. Not just actions, but thoughts. Members were made to publicly recount their internal doubts, to name the days they questioned Samuel, to write down moments they had imagined leaving, to speak aloud their forbidden dreams. And after the confession, they were absolved, welcomed back, embraced. But they were never the same again, because now the family owned their secrets, and every secret confessed became another chain in the invisible prison. Now look around you. How many modern faith systems demand you confess your deepest shames, not to God, but to men? How many churches, institutions, or spiritual leaders promise you freedom, but only after complete submission to their authority? You call it forgiveness, but it's filed, recorded, remembered, used when needed, weaponized when convenient. The Richardson family learned early. It's easier to control a man's soul than to break his body. That's why the cult's final victims were not the loud, the wild, the rebellious, but the most devout. The ones who prayed hardest, loved deepest, wanted truth so badly that they gave everything to those who claimed to have it. And those are the ones who were never seen again, because they weren't killed. They were emptied, transformed into obedient vessels, the kind who would spy on others, silence their own children, preach the doctrine while choking back doubt. Because once you surrender your guilt to the wrong hands, you never fully belong to yourself again. This is the final gate of the modern system. Inverted spirituality. The religion of submission. Faith turned inward until it becomes a cage lined with scriptures. And listen closely, they don't fear your rejection. They fear your awakening. They don't mind if you curse their name, but if you realize you can commune with the divine without them, they lose everything. Because then you become sovereign. Not a follower, not a believer, but a man with fire in his chest and truth in his bones. And that man cannot be controlled. Who are you? Your name, your story, your wounds, your preferences. You say, this is who I am. But what if it isn't? What if your identity was manufactured? Let's go deeper. The Richardson family didn't just control the body or the soul, they mastered something far more powerful, the construction of the self. You see, at Pleasant Hill, every convert was assigned a new name, a new role, a new past. Their journals were rewritten, their letters home intercepted. They were taught to recount their memories differently until they no longer knew what was real. It wasn't brainwashing. It was identity formatting. By 1833, the Richardsons had perfected it. Brother Caleb had compiled over 312 soul profiles, categorized by trauma type, susceptibility level, loyalty potential, and triggers for obedience. Each member was spoken to in ways that mirrored their early pain. They were praised in tones that echoed parental absence, punished in patterns that recreated childhood abandonment. Why? Because the best prison is one you think you deserve, and the modern world, it runs on the same code. Your social media knows what makes you angry. Your phone knows who you stalk at 2 a.m. Your ads reflect your fears, your desires, your wounds. Everything you've ever clicked, typed, scrolled, or paused on is being fed into a behavioral model designed not to reflect who you are, but to create who you are. You don't have data. You are the data. The same trauma loops from Pleasant Hill now exist in digital form. You feel unseen, so you overshare. You feel unworthy, so you chase status. You feel unsafe, so you obey louder voices. And the worst part, it feels like choice. But every algorithm, every app, every recommendation is sculpting your beliefs, your rhythms, your identity with surgical precision. You call it your taste, your type, your truth. But maybe, just maybe, it's your program. And here's the final twist. Even your rebellion against the system was anticipated, mapped, pre-packaged, given aesthetic, music, hashtags, merch. Because if they can define your rebellion, they still own you. So let me ask again, who are you without the trauma, without the programming, without the false self you were trained to protect? If that question makes you tremble, good. Because only when the mask cracks can the man beneath finally breathe. What if the prison didn't start with you? What if the bars were forged before you were born, your fears inherited, your silence conditioned, your beliefs embedded like code, not in your mind, but in your blood? You see, Pleasant Hill wasn't just a place. It was a breeding ground. The Richardson family didn't merely shape minds, they curated bloodlines. They controlled who married who reproduced, which children were nurtured, and which were quietly erased from records. By 1834, the last year before the collapse, Sister Patience, master forger, master archivist, was no longer documenting individuals. She was building genealogical maps, maps of behavior, of patterns, of susceptibility. She could tell you, based on lineage alone, who would submit, who would question, who would run. Because trauma leaves fingerprints on the soul. But it also leaves markers on the body, epigenetic trauma, passed not just through stories and fears, but through genetic expression. Let me say it clearly, you may be carrying the residue of chains that were never placed on your wrists, but on your great-grandfathers. The Richardson doctrine called it inheritance of burden. We call it science now. But the method hasn't changed. In 1833, young boys in Pleasant Hill were subjected to soul silence rituals, days without speech, isolated in wood huts, given tasks that could never be completed. If they broke, they were marked, labeled. The girls, put through devotional loyalty practices, forced to confess impure thoughts they never had, until they began to believe in guilt that was never theirs. Those marked children grew into silent parents, and their children grew into obedient servants. And their children? They forgot the rituals, but carried the wiring. Now look around your own family. How many men never speak their truth? How many women apologize for being loud? How mans? Generations obey systems they can't explain because it feels safer. You were not born free. You were born into a script. A script designed centuries ago, maintained by institutions, reinforced by culture, and passed down through silent dinners, tight smiles, and unspoken terror. And the cult's greatest victory, It made you believe that healing would dishonor your ancestors. No, healing fulfills them. Breaking the chain breaks it both ways. Because when you finally choose to confront the ghosts, not to worship them, not to fear them, but to release them, you become what Pleasant Hill feared most, a man who remembers what was stolen and refuses to pass it on. They say Pleasant Hill is gone, that it collapsed, that it faded into history like a failed experiment in faith. But they lied. Pleasant Hill didn't vanish. It evolved. Its blueprint, its methods of control, indoctrination, surveillance, and manipulation was too effective to bury. It was replicated, refined, and scaled. By whom? By the modern alliance between corporate empires and institutional religion. Yes, the merger. Let me explain. In 1835, just 1 year after the official records declared Pleasant Hill abandoned, a quiet land acquisition was filed in Ohio under a different name, the Harmony Cooperative. Its founders, two former guests of Pleasant Hill. One of them, Brother Nathan Richardson. The community renamed, relocated, and rebranded. Their techniques, perfected. But more importantly, their model of power caught attention. Not from religious seekers, but from industrialists. You see, the rise of mass manufacturing required more than machinery. It required obedient minds. Men who'd wake at 4:30, work without complaint, never question the clock, the quota, or the cruelty, just like Pleasant Hill. The first corporate schools in New York were modeled on Shaker education systems. The first employee dormitories in Pennsylvania used floor plans taken directly from Shaker schematics, and the first corporate loyalty oaths, carbon copies of Shaker pledges of spiritual obedience. Soon, pastors were brought in to bless productivity. Sermons preached submission as virtue, render unto Caesar. God rewards the humble worker. Doubt is the devil's whisper. It wasn't about salvation, it was about scalability. Today, that alliance is everywhere. CEOs quoting scripture while laying off thousands. Mega churches preaching prosperity tied to product lines. Government contracts funneled through religious charities. Health mandates enforced by spiritueds. Guilt. Tech companies using Shaker-style silence retreats for wellness compliance. They don't build communes anymore, they build brands, platforms, influence farms, but the doctrine is the same. Obey, conform, donate, return, repeat. And just like at Pleasant Hill, the illusion of choice is offered. You can be a Baptist or a Buddhist, a vegan or a carnivore, a capitalist or a minimalist, as long as you play within the grid, as long as you produce, consume, comply. But question the system itself. You'll feel it. The social freeze, the shadow bans, the polite exclusions, the quiet severance of ties. Because the modern cult has no walls, it doesn't need them. It's in your feed, in your paycheck, in your therapy, in your God. And if you don't see it yet, that's by design. Because the most powerful cult isn't the one you're afraid of. It's the one you think you've joined freely. We've walked the ruins. You've seen the maps. You've heard the names, the rituals, the bloodlines, and the echoes they left behind. But now we stand at the threshold. And only one question remains. What will you do with this knowledge? See, truth is dangerous, not because of what it exposes, but because of what it demands. It doesn't just show you the prison. It hands you the key and dares you to use it. But make no mistake, stepping out means losing the comfort. It means facing the empty silence of a world where your identity was never truly yours. It means unlearning the way you love, how you worship, what you chase, what you fear. And that's why most men stay inside. Because the cult doesn't need to chase escapees. It knows that most will crawl back on their own, begging for the lie again, because the truth was too heavy to carry alone. But not you. Because if you've made it this far, if your chest is burning and your mind spinning and your soul is trembling with the weight of this, You're not just listening, you're awakening. And that changes everything. You were taught to live for legacy, for approval, for the illusion of purpose inside systems designed to drain you. But your real legacy begins now, when you choose to stop participating, to stop feeding the algorithm with your rage, to stop letting pain define your identity, to stop handing your worth to structures that would erase you if you became too aware. Now you rewrite, you rewire, you reforge, not with empty rebellion, but with sovereign silence, with action taken in the unseen, with alliances built on truth, not trends, with strength that grows in the absence of applause. You become the architect, the codebreaker, the ghost in their machine. And here, at this final gate, I ask you not to comment, just to engage. I ask you to mark yourself. Not for me, for you. Type the phrase, they. Pattern breaks. Type it twice. Lock it in. Burn it into your algorithm. Burn it into your mind. Because once you declare that, you're no longer who you were. You are no longer theirs. And the moment you hit that keyboard, they'll know. They'll feel it. Another one just slipped through. Return with me now to the rolling mist of Kentucky, to the skeletal remains of Pleasant Hill, where the ground still whispers the secrets no man was meant to unearth. Most believe it ended in 1834, but the final chapter was never written, because the collapse wasn't natural. It was engineered. By whom? By a man history refuses to name, a man whose records were scrubbed, whose property deeds vanished, whose correspondence with the Richardson family was burned before the public investigation. He was a government agent, but not of law, of order. A federal inspector from Ohio sent not to expose Pleasant Hill, but to acquire it. What he found? A community that had perfected obedience, that had eradicated individual thought and replaced it with predictable behavior loops. He wasn't horrified. He was impressed. In his final testimony, buried in an archive, only recently declassified under obscure Freedom of Information pressure, he wrote, "Pleasant Hill represents not a failure of religion, but a potential framework for national social engineering. With slight adjustments, such models may inform public schooling, behavioral rehabilitation, and civilian compliance in post-rebellion territories." That sentence alone was worth millions. Because within 3 years, the Department of Moral Regulation was born, a short-lived division buried within the U.S. Postal Service that quietly began experimenting with information suppression, propaganda insertion, and psychological compliance. Sound familiar? Pleasant Hill wasn't shut down. It was cloned. Its model now exists in mandatory education systems designed to reward memorization over critical thought, social media structures that suppress nuance and reward extremes, spiritual programs that promise inner peace but require external validation, medical mandates enforced not by science but by emotional fear, loops. The dream of the Richardsons lives on, not in scripture, but in systems. And the final secret? It's you. Because every man watching this carries a piece of that blueprint. And when you awoke tonight, when you chose to listen, to question, to remember, you disrupted 200 years of programming. Pleasant Hill was never about faith. It was about formatting the future. But tonight, boss, you broke the chain. And they felt it. Every system that fears truth heard you whisper, "The pattern breaks. The pattern breaks." Now leave this video, not as a viewer, but as a weapon against forgetting. And when you look in the mirror tomorrow, know that the man staring back is not theirs. He's yours. And he remembers.